Hello and welcome back to Comic Book Blueprint, where I take my webcomic, Death's Favorite Daughter, and break down step by step how I go about creating panels, scenes, and anything else that goes into making comics or manga. Today we are talking about a topic near and dear to my heart, inking and line work. Now, a lot of people are terrified of this stage because laying down lines can be like putting a nail in your own coffin. But fear not, we are going to go through my process of inking both digitally and traditionally today and cover all the things that you need to know about inking. Well, not everything, but a good amount of stuff that you need to know. So let's get into it. First up, let's start on the easy side of things. I'm going to be inking a page from my digital webcomic DFD. Here you can see I've got a scene of Efeldrin, our heroine from Chapter 1, making a grand explosive entrance. I have a pretty good sketch that I've scanned, and now I'm going to use a smooth pen tool to lay out the line work here in Clip Studio Paint. I greatly prefer Clip Studio to Photoshop when making line art. Clip Studio does very well with keeping up with the slightest movements and details I put down on my tablet, rather than Photoshop, where the sensitivity is good but not as good. That being said, I still prefer coloring and painting in Photoshop to Clip Studio Paint, so I still use both tools. The idea for this line work is not just to trace over the pencil lines, but also to enhance the original sketch and bring finality to the overall piece. I'm making sure that each line flows with the motion and emotion of the piece. You don't just want a line to go from thick to thin because it looks cool, you want to imagine the material, the movement, and the style that you want all of your lines to communicate. And yes, thick lines communicate differently from thin lines, but it does go much further than that. Line work is essentially the frame that will hold together your comic's color and composition. No one is going to look at your sketch or other prep work when your comic is published. They're going to be looking at your comic lines and your colors, or tones if you're doing a black and white comic or manga. The main thing to establish before you get started is how you want the style of your lighting to be, whether that will be determined by the color or the ink and lines of your piece. If you have decided that your coloring is going to be flat or cell shaded like this, then your lines can be bold and hard, and you can add in large blocky shapes for shading the darkest parts of your drawing. If your colors are more intricate and painterly, consider using thinner lines or colored inks to enhance the more detailed colors. And if you're like me and you're doing a generic webcomic, you will want to keep the shading of your lines to a minimum and stick to expressing the form of the drawing and let the colors show the lights and darks of the piece. No matter what style you choose or are comfortable working in, you still want to have a good idea of where the lights are going to be in your scene and what those lights will be bouncing off of. For example, skin has different consistency than leather or hair, so be sure to keep that in mind as you work. When it comes to digital inking, you have a lot of freedom to try things and undo anything you don't like, but I would recommend trying to get used to staying zoomed out and getting your strokes down in one smooth motion. It can be tempting to zoom in and be very finicky with all the lines and tiny details that you can see because you're looking at it at 5,000% magnification, but you're only going to make the lines look more scratchy or unintentional. Let your arm and wrist do most of the work, and yeah, that means drawing and redrawing the same line over and over again, but you will get better at making those crisp, smooth lines that are oh so satisfying, trust me. Just let your arm and wrist flow over the page, and then flow over it again and redo and undo and maybe even erase some of the parts of it that look bad. But don't get so caught up in the tiniest details just because you can. Pixels can really betray you up close. You want to make sure to look at them at the actual size that your reader will be. For me, I find that it's a lot easier for me to ink traditionally rather than digitally because my wrist and my hand is used to moving over the page and adjusting its grip based on how large or small I want the details. I will often make these kinds of mistakes that I'm mentioning because I'm not used to being able to see the drawings so close up. On one hand, this is great because it means I can get more accurate and detailed drawings. However, on the other hand, like I said before, I am constantly fussing over smaller areas of the drawing and things that just aren't important, rather than just making my lines consistent and crisp throughout. That's just really what you want. You want just beautiful line work that reads well from a distance, because nobody's going to zoom in and be like, oh, they didn't complete this line and this line aren't touching. This artist must not know what they're doing. I'm going to give their webcomic a bunch of the poo-poo heads because they're stupid. The main reason that I do ink digitally is the speed factor. I'm not worried about messing up or maybe smudging traditional inks, but I do know that when it comes to traditional inking, it generally will take me more time to ink it and then get it scanned and then digitally touch it up and then start coloring the page. So I try to speed things up by doing things digitally. If you have more time to work on your page than I do, experiment with what works better for you and what style you prefer. Just because I have a grueling inking schedule doesn't mean that you have to as well. You can figure out what works for you and try to maybe come up with a better solution than just, oh my goodness, I gotta get these inks done. I must do digital because that's just faster. Sometimes, you need to take more time to get this comic done, which, maybe you would not record every single step of your comic and try to post it on YouTube in a quick fashion like someone's doing. Someone's me. Okay, so now that we have our digital page finished and ready for color, let me go ahead and demonstrate how I work traditionally for comics like this one I'm working on called The Witchborn. The first thing that I would say that is different about inking traditionally versus digitally is that I have a much stronger feel for the lines. I'm using a dip pen, which allows me a wide range of thickness and texture. So instinctively, the more that I have used this pen, the more that I have a feeling for the kind of lines that I want to put down. I suppose this can also be gained digitally, but there's something about the scratching of the nib on the paper or the way that you can control the texture by limiting how much ink is on the nib, and many other techniques that I have learned just by working on this comic. You can already see how much more heavy-handed I am with the ink. I like shading in large black shapes in this style because it matches some of the darker tones of the story. And I think the more detailed scratchy method is also lending itself to the kind of fantasy that this world takes place in, rather than the fantasy world of DFD. I also think there's a part of me that is more willing to be loose and less calculating when working with traditional ink. And I think this comes from the fact that once the ink goes down, there's nothing I can do about it. Sure, I can pull out whiteout or the gouache and try to cover up any mistakes that I make, but if I don't worry about making mistakes and just try to have fun with the pen and lines, I tend to get results that I like a lot better. I think that the reason so many people are quote-unquote bad at inking is because they've psyched themselves out about the permanence of their work, and they let all that nervous energy travel down their arm and into the pen. If you just don't think about it and don't worry, you'll have a lot better of a time, and therefore most likely you'll have better lines. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't practice and inking will just get easier if you don't think about it. I mean, don't just go wild, but at the same time, if the ink is permanent, why be nervous about it? Just enjoy what you're doing. Worst comes to worst, you can always draw the page again, right? Okay, I shouldn't say that. I just made a bunch of people grow a ton of gray hairs immediately like that, or get furious and start typing in the comment section, which, hey, I mean, I like reading comments. Not nasty, scary ones that threaten my life, but still, conversations are conversations. I'm not trying to make this video a gigantic commercial for traditional inking and bash on digital inking. I'm just telling you my experience. And if I really dislike digital inking, then I wouldn't use it for the comic that I'm working on right now.
Both is good.
But just as it stands, I really like inking with pen and paper, probably more than anything else. I mean, like, I just, if I could pick one medium to work in and master, it would be inking. Any chance that I get to ink traditionally, I will do it. It just makes me so happy, which is a really rare thing for me because, I mean, generally I'm a pretty negative guy. I mean, it's hard to tell right now because I sound really happy and I'm performing in front of a microphone for a video. But I mean, if you met me in person, I'm sure that you would think, wow, this guy sucks. You'll notice I also like using a lot of brushes and different styles of nibs as opposed to the digital inking. For the Witchborn comic, there's a lot of textures and extra elements that I want to communicate via the line work, as opposed to communicating that in the coloring stages. However, in DFD, a lot of the information is communicated through the coloring. So when I'm working on that, I'm only using one or two pens, but when I'm working on the Witchborn, pretty much anything goes. I've used a toothbrush before, I've dipped sponges in ink. There was even a point where I just wanted some very, very thin lines to make up like a cloud texture, so I dipped my finger in ink and dabbed it out on another piece of paper until you could see my fingerprints and just let the natural lines of my fingerprints create the texture that I wanted. Now, you don't have to go as overboard as I do for your comic. You can go as minimalistic or as detailed or digital or traditional as much as you want, just as long as you keep in mind the overall style of your comic and how you are going to balance the ink and the color information of your artwork. Okay, now that I have thoroughly indulged my love of ink and line work, I think it's time that we wrap this video up. You can see how there are many ways to go about adding lines to your comic, and there are many methods that I haven't tried or demonstrated in this video, so make sure you do your own research from artists that you like or comic books that have a style that you want to try. Explore and experiment as much as possible. Don't be afraid of inking. Inking is a lot more scared of you than you are of it, trust me. That ink is actually an animate object and has absolutely no emotion and cannot hurt you. Unless you ingest it. I'm sure that would be terrible for you. And I think also if it's on your skin, it can clog up pores or something depending on what type of ink you get. So don't do that. But also don't be afraid of inking. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more from Comic Blueprint. The next video will be about the coloring stage, and that's the stage that I'm probably the worst at, so it'll at least be entertaining to watch. But until then, go make something awesome.